Hello and welcome to the world of intelligence. For more information on how we can help with OSINT training and development, go to janes.com/OSINT training.
I'm Terry Pattar. I'm the director of the Janes Intelligence Unit. On this podcast, we'll be talking to Dr. Martha Whitesmith, who is a research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome, Martha.
Hello, Terry.
Great to have you on this episode. The reason we wanted to get you on the podcast was because when we talk about open source intelligence, a lot of the focus is often on information collection, but information collection is only part of the process. And the big part that we always talk about, particularly in our training, is actually what you do with the information once you've got it, how you analyze it, how you use it to answer specific questions, how you make a sense of that information to make it relevant to your customers. And that's where we wanted to talk to you, because you've done some really interesting research on the role of cognitive biases in the analysis process. And it would be great to talk to you about some of the findings from your research and some of the conclusions that you've reached in terms of how analysis can potentially be improved, and actually how some of the techniques people might already be using, structured techniques, for example, maybe aren't as useful as they think they are. I was sort of having a look at one of your previous articles, and in there you talked about how you tested one particular technique. So the analysis of competing hypotheses, ACH, which will, I think, be familiar to quite a few people listening. It would be great to get an understanding from you of the research you did, how you went about it, and what you found. So I'd like to sort of get you to talk about that. Before you do, maybe if you wanted to give a bit of an introduction to yourself as well, in terms of some of your background and how you got to that point where you decided you wanted to research this topic.
So my background was actually a practitioner experience. I was an intelligence analyst for about 5 years, mainly looking at terrorism threats. And a lot of the training we got on how to do more rigorous analysis or how to avoid bias in our analysis was based around one particular method, the ACH method, that was devised by the CIA in, I think, the 1990s and is fairly prevalent across Western intelligence world as being the go-to teaching on how to improve the rigour of your work. And my background at that point in terms of academia was that I'd done an MA in philosophy for my sins, specifically looking at logic and also the philosophy of epistemology, which is how you can be confident that you have justification for believing something to be true and what the standards are for establishing knowledge. So I decided for my PhD to actually put it to the test in an experimental setting and to see whether it did what it intended to do, which was initially to reduce the risk of cognitive bias in intelligence analysis by at least making it explicit for peer review. So for people who don't know much about the ACH method, it's a fairly simple analytic method which was inspired by the scientific methodology of eliminative induction, which was developed by Francis Bacon and then developed by other people such as Karl Popper, which is basically a fairly simple but effective principle that it's a lot easier to prove a hypothesis is false than it is to prove that it's true, because the bar for establishing truth is so high. In many cases it's considered to be impossible. Even in the natural sciences, truth is taken to be a revisionary concept, that you accept a theory as true with the best evidence you have, but if you get more evidence that changes that, you accept the new answer. But you still go with the best argument you have, even if it changes. So truth can change in that sense. Whereas it only takes one piece of good evidence to disprove a theory, but you can have an infinite amount of evidence which supports the truth of a hypothesis, and then you only need one to come along to show that it's false. So it saves a lot of time to try and disprove hypotheses rather than to try and prove them, which is a key principle of the scientific method.
So is it that process of eliminating different options until you're left with the ones that you think are therefore that you haven't yet eliminated and which still have some supporting evidence, so to be more sure perhaps that they're more likely to be your answer?
Yes, it's basically a way of saving time. in analysis and making the use of the information you have more impactful. So the key principles of ACH is that you come up with a range of multiple hypotheses and you rank the information that you have against those hypotheses. And if there's sufficient information to disprove any of them, you take them out, and then hopefully you end up with one left standing, and that is the hypothesis which you have the best justification for taking as being true, essentially. So it's a fairly simple idea based on a very widely used principle that's used within the sciences. So far, so good. But because it's an umbrella technique, you can apply different information ranking systems, and some of them will be valid for establishing whether the information you have actually supports the truth or falsity of a hypothesis, whereas others won't. So it's open to misuse. Mainly, you know, no one's intentionally trying to misuse the system, but unless you have that background knowledge about which information ranking systems are appropriate, it can end up being providing a bit of a false sense of rigor.
So just for those who aren't necessarily familiar with the technique, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but essentially you would have you would draw up a table where you've got your hypotheses maybe listed at the top, and then you would list the evidence down the side, and you're essentially ranking the evidence against each hypothesis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And part of that is designed to enable you to be more rigorous in how you weigh up evidence against each hypothesis, and like you say, to be able to identify where you've got the bit of evidence that will help you disprove each hypothesis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
I should, at this point, I should probably apologise to anybody who's been on one of my training courses and has been trained by me in this technique, because they're going to get a much more detailed explanation of how it works in this podcast. So hopefully they're listening. But yeah, this is great. Okay. Yeah, please continue.
So yeah, that's the basis on which ACH is meant to work. The effectiveness of it depends entirely on what information ranking systems are used, and because it's an umbrella method, it's open. I've seen various different ranking systems applied, from basic is information relevant, does it have diagnostic value, which is slightly different to relevance, and is a technique which originated in the medical sciences. You can use assessments of whether information is credible, and I've also seen people try and use subjective Bayesianism, which is a form of subjective probability assessment as well. So it's open to using multiple systems, but also you can use more than one if they're not trying to do the same thing. So, for instance, you can combine diagnostic value with credibility of information to give separate scores. But anyway, so my research was attempting to test in an experimental setting whether ACH was actually effective in reducing the risk of cognitive bias.
So how does it work in terms of, or in theory, how should it work in terms of reducing the impact of cognitive bias?
That was a question I had, because from my background in philosophy, I couldn't see any part of the design that would provide mitigation for the risk of bias.
Is there a challenge there in that, within the modern world, we are faced with many, many more decisions to make, and people suffer from decision fatigue, and the sort of cognitive burden of having to make lots of decisions actually is quite wearisome.
So yes, the research I did was trying to test, you can come up with an assessment as whether ACH would work or not, but you really need to put it in practice to see whether it does, because it might have something in it inherently that you haven't spotted which could work. So we put it to the test, working with the Cabinet Office and their team, the professional heads of intelligence analysis, who lead coordination of training for intelligence analysts across the UK community. We asked them if they would be willing to provide their up-to-date training in ACH, so that we were making sure that we were testing a version of ACH, which was actually going to have some impact for the intelligence community today, rather than picking one available in open source that isn't widely used, given that there's such a proliferation of different versions. So the PHIA very kindly offered to help and provided the training in ACH, how they taught it, which I think was the version they use is probably the most commonly used across the Five Eyes world, at least, or at least the Western world.
Great.
So, so that version specifically uses diagnostic value of information as a ranking system, and that's the only information ranking system it uses. So,
when you say diagnostic value, so what do we mean by that? Unpack that a little bit.
So basically, diagnostic value is information that allows you to choose between two or more hypotheses. Basically, it will only apply to one and not another. So it's used in the medical sciences to differentiate between possible diagnoses. When you look at symptoms, you can say, well, this symptom applies to this condition, but not that condition. So if this symptom is present, it points to A hypothesis rather than the B hypothesis. It's basically you form mutually exclusive hypotheses that particular bits of evidence will only apply to one and cannot apply to another.
Got it. And I think this hints at, I think, an area where the people have to be aware of when they are going to use the ACH technique, that it works really only in contexts where you can have those mutually exclusive hypotheses. Would that be fair?
It depends. It depends.
Does it depend on how it's used?
Oh no, I guess it depends on how complex the hypotheses are, I would say, because some hypotheses can be as simple as a single sentence or a single premise, whereas others contain multiple premises. Say the difference between, if you have hypothesis A is ISIL are present in Syria only versus hypothesis B of ISIL are present in Iraq only. Those would be two mutually exclusive hypotheses. Whereas you could have an ACH where you're comparing hypothesis A, which is ISIL are trying to develop chemical weapons for use in an external attack against the West, versus the hypothesis of ISIL are trying to develop chemical weapons to use in an attack in Syria or Iraq. You could then have information which supports the truth of ISIL developing chemical weapons, but doesn't give any indication of where they intend or how, if they intend to deploy it. That information would provide support for both hypotheses in part.
Yes.
But so it wouldn't differentiate, but it would still be relevant. So it would be relevant information, but not diagnostic, if that makes sense. So it really depends how you set up the hypotheses, and whether they're single premises that are mutually exclusive or not. So yeah, there are various different ways you can do ACH.
Got it. Right. Okay.
Which makes it quite complicated to critique.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay.
Sorry, I've just realised that I made an error about what I said, that the ACH version, which the PHIA teach, only uses one system. It also uses the system of credibility of information. So it is two systems. So it's diagnostic value and how credible is that information. So that was the version which was taught as part of the study we did. So
it's sort of applying a weighting, therefore, in terms of giving more significance to information which is maybe has a higher rating credibility, and is more diagnostic.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Which is really the best way to do it. We can get onto later, but essentially, unless you have a ranking system that involves assessing the quality of the information you have in terms of the epistemic support it gives, whether it's credible or not, ACH doesn't really have the kind of rigor you want it to. Information could be perfectly relevant, but unless there's any reason for you to believe it to be true, its worth hasn't been established, essentially. Relevance doesn't necessarily guarantee truth or provide any support for believing something to be true.
Yes, got it. And equally, I suppose, if you've got information where you can't verify it, or you're not sure how credible it is, if it's still highly relevant, it may still be useful.
Yes. Yeah. The study I did focused on 2 particular types of cognitive bias, and there have been dozens that have been identified in the social sciences or in psychology. So I picked the 2 that had actually been identified as being involved in previous intelligence failures that were influenced by analytical decisions, specifically the decision to go to war with Iraq in 2003, and also the Yom Kippur War decision as well. So these 2 biases have been identified in official reviews of intelligence failures influenced by analysis. So there is some reason to believe that they can affect intelligence analysis.
Very interesting.
We were trying to set up the study to make it as realistic and relevant as possible, given the amount of choice you have for biases and versions of ACH. So
sure.
These 2 biases are serial position effects and confirmation bias. So serial position effects is basically where the position of the piece of information in the sequence which you process all the information you have has an influence on the decisions you make. So specifically, it's information that you process first or last towards the end. And there are 2 types of serial position effects that have been identified in quite a lot of research in the social sciences, mainly to do with memory, but also to do with belief formation. And that's primacy and recency. So primacy is where the information you process early on in a piece of analysis or decision making has a disproportionate influence on your beliefs compared with the information you process during the middle or towards the end. And recency is where the information you read towards the end has a disproportionate effect over the information you read first and in the middle.
And is one of those, or does one of those have a greater effect than the other? Because I mean, I find this particularly fascinating, and it's something that we've touched on whenever we've talked to people in our training courses about cognitive biases and analysis and all of the issues that occur within an analysis. And I think we highlighted primacy. I think in terms of the recency of the information, I think that maybe gets overlooked sometimes. So was there one or other that you found more significant?
Yeah, I don't think you can compare them in terms of significance, in terms of the impact they have, because both of them will basically mean that the beliefs you have will be influenced by chance rather than rigor. But primacy is the prevalent one that's identified in scientific research. So I think I did a meta-analysis of all of the relevant studies I could find, and which involved over 12,000 participants.
Wow.
No, sorry, over 12,000 participants, and somewhere between 80 and 90% of the results was primacy rather than recency. So primacy is much more prevalent, whereas recency is less common. So in terms of impact, people are more likely to be influenced by primacy in analysis than recency. And the meta-analysis I did looking at what analytical conditions increase the risk showed a correlation between primacy and tasks where you had a large volume of information to process, and recency correlated with tasks where there was a short amount of information to process. So I think the longer you have to conduct analysis over time, and the more information you have, increases the risk of primacy, if that makes sense.
So yeah, definitely. That's really interesting.
So
Yeah.
yes, I think it is right to focus a bit more on primacy purely because the risk is so much higher. But yes, recency shouldn't be overlooked either.
Okay.
And yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to understanding what analytical factors increase the risk of each, to know which one you are more likely to have been subject to. But the chances of you being subject to serial position effects when you form beliefs is surprisingly high. So it's definitely something to be aware of.
Okay.
And that's not necessarily conducting complex analysis. It could be something as simple as judging the length of a stick. The range of experiments covered everything. A lot of them focused on forming impressions of other people from just reading descriptions or having descriptive words being applied to one person rather than another. So even in everyday decision making and very simple beliefs and judgments, primacy is a big deal as well, which is quite interesting. It's not just the kind of analysis we think of as being affected by these biases. It's pretty much every situation in which you have to process information and make some sort of judgment on it will be subject to serial position effects.
That's so interesting. I when you talk about that effect being so pervasive effect, in terms of what it does, in terms of when we experience it, it's not just when we're sitting down dealing with sort of complex questions, but it is, much more a day-to-day occurrence. You think actually this is something that people should be much more aware of, and I don't think people are.
Yes, I think the biggest one for me was realizing that actually the rules of courts and jurors in cases of who gets to go first in presenting the case, whether it's the defence or the prosecution, essentially whoever gets to go first has a higher chance of influencing the jury. So the whole concept of fairness in the court of law goes out of the window just by our biology.
Wow.
A huge impact for civil life, which I personally find terrifying. I think
that is incredible. Yeah,
we have such an idea of human rationality that it isn't always as secure as we would like it to be.
No, indeed.
Especially when it comes to intelligence decision making. The degree of impact on human life that can come out of intelligence failures. We've already seen decisions to go to war, prevention of terrorist attacks, which can be a huge scale, as we've seen with 9/11. The idea that you have analysts worldwide who are responsible for predicting those kind of events, but just are battling like everybody else against the wiring of your brains and rational processes, and that essentially a large degree of it comes down to what intelligence they receive first.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable, isn't it? And I seem to remember a quote, I think it was from Sherman Kent, about how intelligence analysts should have better training in the rigor of doing analysis than normal people, and so should be better equipped to guard against these things. But I think and as you're about to describe, I guess what's sort of borne out in some of the research is that with all the training that has been applied to date, I don't think anyone's quite cracked it in terms of enabling intelligence analysts to be a step ahead of somebody who's not trained.
Yes, well, it's also, I think, managing expectations about how far you can train people to overcome what is a very human and natural weakness in cognitive processes. How can you train people to guard against subconscious processes that happen to everybody? Is it fair to have that expectation as well? Is another question. I think you always see after intelligence failures in the official investigations afterwards, there's always something coming out about, the public have to have a certain understanding that we can't, that the intelligence services can't prevent every single attack, and it's just, and that's just human. Sometimes
you're right, and and that's in cases where, for the most part, they won't have a complete picture. Obviously, I mean that's the nature of intelligence. But even where they have got quite good information, it's so easy for analysts to make mistakes. That they miss things and that things go awry because of that. But and so I mean, so you've talked about the serial effects. Positioning effects of when we see information or when we receive information. And then you'd also in your research looked at cognitive biases.
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation biases, yes.
Basically, confirmation bias is when you form a leading hypothesis which you think is the most likely, and then information which you receive after that point that doesn't agree or directly contradicts that hypothesis doesn't have an equal impact on your belief adjustment process as the original information that led you to focus on that hypothesis. So it means that valid information that doesn't agree with your underlying belief gets either dismissed or isn't given the same weighting in your consideration. And this is all a subconscious process. You don't realise that you're doing it. But yes, it's basically you apply a biased way of processing subsequent information once you've formed a focal hypothesis. And that can happen in different ways. Either you dismiss information entirely or it's not given the same credence.
Does that potentially also lead analysts to simply not perceive information that sort of disagrees with what they think is the likely answer? They just sort of miss it.
Yeah, it could mean that it could lead people to believe very honestly that information isn't relevant when it actually is.
Got it.
So it's and there isn't as much research on it as there is serial position effects, but the research that is available, when you look at it, the prevalence isn't quite as high as serial position effects, but it's still pretty high. I think from memory it was roughly between 70 and 80% of the participants in the sample I had, which was about 1,200 participants, exhibited some form of confirmation bias.
Wow.
So it's still a big risk.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So we put the ACH method taught by PHIA to the test against those two biases, and the results were that there was zero impact of ACH in reducing bias. I think
So just to go back over that, sorry, Martha, just go back over that. Zero impact.
Zero impact. Yes,
Wow.
the number of participants in the ACH group that exhibited bias was exactly the same as the control group. So there wasn't even any statistical difference to test for statistical significance. There was no difference whatsoever. So unfortunately, that was a very damning.
Like I said, that is remarkable because as a technique, it makes sense.
Yeah.
When you sort of look at it and you understand it, you think, especially if you're looking for a solution that will help you guard against some of those issues that you've talked about there. It really is something you look at, you think, you know what, I can make use of this, I can apply it to my work, and it should help me make my analysis more rigorous and make sure I'm not falling foul of any of these potential pitfalls and or risks that could occur within my thinking. But actually, it doesn't seem to have that benefit.
And I think the weakness is really in the information ranking systems used to process the information rather than the the concept of ACH itself is when the way I designed the study was to be able to have markers which flagged up when bias was happening, but also identify when it was happening in judgments of credibility and when it was happening for judgments of diagnostic value. And it was able to influence both of those ranking systems.
Wow.
So it's basically the information ranking systems you use, you will still be making subjective, subconscious judgments in what scores you give. So there isn't anything.
That's really interesting, because I think yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's really interesting, because that's one of the things, I think we've always tried to highlight in our training, is that when people are using this method, they've got to be conscious that if it's used improperly, they could actually further embed their confirmation bias, etc., and some of these issues, and it makes it harder in a way to see past it, because you've got a method which in your mind has maybe led you to a conclusion which you think, oh well, I've rigorously tested this, or I've gone through this process which makes my analysis that much more valid, and actually it's done the opposite.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily done the opposite. It's just it just gives the appearance of rigor where there isn't. It doesn't provide any guarding against the subconscious process that would involve bias anyway. It just means that you're putting it in a framework that other people can look at. But one of the basically ACH was designed to make it obvious to other people looking at your working where bias might have happened. But unless you actually have a process of recording the degree to which each piece of information influences someone's belief in the hypothesis, irrespective of what scoring they give it, you can't really identify whether bias might have happened, because the only way in which you can identify whether bias has happened is by seeing whether people have given say if you're looking for whether confirmation bias has affected how people rank the credibility of information, you would need to be able to compare the scores that people give to information based on the degree to which it strengthens their belief in different hypotheses. Because if they score the first piece of information they have as medium credibility, but it leads them to give an 80% score in confidence, and then another piece of information which they read later on is scored medium, but it only impacts their judgment by, say, a 5% margin, that's the same score of credibility, but it has a lower impact on their belief process. So you would need to actually see, almost like incorporate an analyst's confidence in their belief, or like a separate belief score, to actually identify where those where bias might have occurred. Because that's really the only way you can do it. So without knowing how much influence a piece of information actually had on the analyst's personal belief in each hypothesis, the scores won't tell you much, because just because two things have been ranked as high credibility, low or medium, it doesn't mean that they've had the same proportionate impact on the belief formation, if that makes sense.
It does. That is very interesting. So the critical component there is the confidence in the scoring of the sort of credibility and relevance.
Yeah. Or you can have cases where most of the participants would have scored one particular piece of information as low credibility, and then a minority score it as high, and that minority of people happen to have a strong initial degree of belief very early on about a particular hypothesis that information supports, which has led them to give it a high credibility scoring because it's in line with what they already think is true. And that's a subconscious process, but it means that the bias can influence how you rank information anyway. So the difficulty is trying to find a way of getting people to subconsciously rank information in an objective manner. I'm not sure if that's possible. So I think if ACH is intended to identify bias, you need to be able to record the degree of impact that information has on whether someone believes something is true, because they will be subconsciously forming an opinion from the very first piece of information they read, and that will affect how they judge information which they then get and put into the system. So if you can't guard against bias affecting the way you rank information, then you aren't providing any mitigation for bias happening by using ACH. And the current versions of it don't provide any way of showing where bias might be happening. So even if you have peer review, you can't flag where bias might have occurred. You can have difference of opinion about whether the scores given to particular bits of information are accurate and objective, which is useful. So it makes your decision-making process explicit for peer review, which does have a really good benefit.
So to do that, though, presumably, so let's say if I'm creating, or if I'm using this process to help me address a particular question, if as I'm going through it and I'm adding evidence and I'm, scoring that evidence, I've almost got to do it in a way so that whoever comes and reviews it provides that peer review to help me make sure that I'm not being biased in any particular way. It's got to be done in a way that reviewer can see how I've made those decisions at each step of the process.
Yeah.
Right. So they've almost got to be able to replay it as if it were a video, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also it's only really going to be effective if you've captured the judgment making process when it happens, because the way memory works is you revise your memory of events anyway according to what happens afterwards without realizing as well. So how you remembered the reasons you remember having for giving a particular piece of information a particular diagnostic value or credibility score might be completely different from the ones that actually influenced you. So unless you have it in quite a very complicated experimental condition where after each piece of information you ask the participants to write down their justification for their scoring or why they gave it that score, it might not tell you the actual original thinking anyway.
Right, yes. But at that point, once you add that level of additional effort to the technique,
it becomes incredibly cumbersome.
Yes, and you're sort of losing that initial benefit you're talking about of trying to speed up decision making.
Yeah, it isn't really practical.
Oh.
Yes, so there is a big question of how you can adapt ACH to actually identify where bias might have occurred, but doing it in a way that doesn't mean you spend your entire professional life conducting an ACH is a big one. And I think a lot of it will come down to making it a automated computer technique, click this button, do this score, and asking analysts to record their degree of belief in each of the hypotheses after they put a bit of information in, and then having a way of the electronic system, IT system, being able to flag where biases might have occurred just by discrepancies in the scoring system and the degree of belief. You could do it that way, but I think that is really the only practical way you could do it.
Interesting. But even then, potentially you would only use it for those occasions when the decision that you're going to make off the back of it might be quite critical, rather than for every sort of situation where you've got a question to answer.
Yeah, I think, you would have to have some sort of understanding of, because testing for bias in every single judgment you make during a process of analysis isn't practical, because you will have subject matter experts who will be looking at a particular group answering multiple exam questions over a course of, maybe even 10 years. You can't expect them to run an ACH on every single decision and run an ACH over the course of 10 years. It's just not feasible. So having some sort of benchmark for the kind of decision making you want to apply it to. But even then, you have to have that in place before you start your belief formation process. You can't implement an ACH halfway through on a topic where analysts already have established beliefs about the topic.
Right.
Because their prior beliefs will influence the judgments they make when ranking new information. And so
you've almost got to get, as well as doing the technique, or at the outset really, you've got to get people to identify their assumptions.
Yeah, and that's as challenging. You're still asking people to tap into their subconscious.
Of course, yeah.
Make it explicit to themselves and anyone else, and I'm not really sure.
I wonder if there's some form of psychometric test you could use to apply at the start. But then even then, you're adding another level of complexity to the technique, and it starts to
employ a hypnotist.
Who knows? Yeah, who knows? Maybe that's where this technique goes next. Yeah.
But I think knowledge about how biases impact our thinking can probably help give people an understanding of where ACH can have benefit and what situations it should be employed in, rather than assuming that you can deploy it in any situation at any point during a process of forming beliefs and it will give you the rigor you want and guard against bias. I think is at least helpful.
Definitely. I think that's actually really valuable. And from my perspective, I know I found in the past when I, first sort of started to learn more about the role of bias and the sort of subconscious elements you talked about, that it made me more aware of them, even if it's difficult to guard against the effects. But I think what it does, or certainly where it helped me, and I don't know, it'd be great to get your thoughts on this, but as an intelligence analyst, I found it made me more humble and more willing to accept when others would critique my work, perhaps, or come up with alternative solutions, or point out, where I might have actually been biased in assessing a piece of information. So I don't know if you found it to have those sorts of benefits.
As part of the meta-analysis we did look at the whether people being held accountable for their judgments had any influence on whether they were affected by bias or not. The idea that if you actually have to provide justification for why you came up with your assessment, maybe that would help guard against bias than if you just provide it anonymously and there's no consequence for your behaviour. So I think that's probably the closest we came to looking at that kind of degree of confidence, is comparing situations where analysts were aware before they started the task that there would be some sort of consequence or accountability for their judgments, or at least they would be publicly linked to their judgments. But unfortunately, and very surprisingly for me, that didn't have a statistically significant effect in reducing serial position effects. And unfortunately, the sample size of research available on confirmation bias wasn't really wide enough in terms of testing accountability to allow us to identify whether there were any. So a lot more research needs to be done to see whether holding people accountable in some way for their beliefs does actually reduce bias. But so far, it doesn't.
Oh, okay. Okay, so
but I think it does make people more open to, as you say, peer review of their work. But the other interesting thing is, as part of a follow-up study I'm doing into looking at biases, basically extending the meta-analysis research to a lot more biases than just serial position effects and confirmation bias. There's a type of bias called the backfire effect, which is a form of confirmation bias where having people challenge beliefs you already hold or question or presenting disconfirming evidence has a backfire effect in that it ends up strengthening the original belief that someone had.
Yes.
And it all comes down to the way in which information is the way in which disconfirming information is presented, and how far the belief that people have has some sort of emotional significance to them, how much they are attached to it in a sense of if you try to present disconfirming evidence as a challenge analysis function to an analyst who is particularly attached in some way, either emotionally or linked to their sense of identity for a particular hypothesis, then it could actually backfire and only serve to strengthen their original belief. And if their original belief is false, then the whole point of challenge analysis has the opposite effect in which it's intended.
That's really interesting. I think we've probably all seen occasions where that's happened.
Yeah. It's like the anti-vaxxer movement. If people are, it is a very emotive topic because essentially it's people trying to do the best thing to protect their children from harm. Trying to change anti-vaccination attitudes is particularly challenging because of the emotive content. So it comes down to how do you do it? And in a lot of those kind of cases, presenting information in a very scientific, clinical, rational way doesn't have any impact. It's if you present it in an emotive way that doesn't cause confrontation or friction for the emotive reason of the original belief, then it can help persuade people's minds. But it's knowing how to present information in order to actually persuade people to change their minds is another field entirely. So even having challenge function is complicated, depending on how far people are wedded to their original beliefs, how open-minded they are, and if they have a particular belief that they think is true over others, what's the basis of that connection?
Really interesting.
It is extraordinarily complicated trying to get analysis to be a rigorous process, and it's difficult. I think a lot of people look to the sciences when they try and come up with methods to apply or adapt for intelligence analysis, because the sciences have the comfort of it's difficult to argue against the evidence because the evidence quality is of such a way, it is empirical. Once you have that level of reliable data, it's just a question of how you interpret it. You can't argue the data, but you can argue about the interpretation.
Of course.
But with intelligence, quite a lot of the information you're getting is testimony. It's from human sources. It's relying on people's memory of.
It could be deliberately deceptive.
Yes, it could be a piece of deception. So you don't have the same level of quality of information. You don't just have to worry about how you interpret the information. You have to worry about establishing the quality of the information in the first place. So there is so much, I personally think, and the research I did, I think, would back it up, is that intelligence analysis runs a greater risk of being influenced by bias than other areas such as the sciences. Not in every case, but it's certainly one of the more vulnerable areas just by the quality of information that you have to work with.
I think you've hit on a great point there, and I think it's one that's really underrated and people don't sort of think about enough, is that intelligence analysis is a different discipline.
Yeah.
The quality of the information, as you said, it can be so varied, and it's difficult to, I think, sometimes take techniques and apply them from other contexts. But at the same time, I wouldn't rule out, that people should look at other fields and try to learn things and apply them to intelligence analysis. But yeah, it's just adapting things, I suppose, or making sure that we understand the limitations of those techniques and we don't sort of see them as a solution to problems that maybe they don't actually solve.
I think that is a very good point, and especially one I would agree with coming from the background of philosophy. A lot of analytical methods have been devised for a very specific type of analysis or very specific circumstances, which means that their application to intelligence is limited, and to use them properly you have to understand how they work in their original context to know when you can and can't use them in intelligence. Otherwise you end up thinking that you're applying the rigor that you would have in the original context, say using scientific methods. Scientific methodology has the rigor because of the quality of information it deals with. But if you just blanketly apply it to intelligence analysis without taking into account the quality of information, then you can have the impression that you have the same level of vigor, which you don't, of rigor, which you don't. It also comes down to when people try and cross over judgments of probability and say, well, if we can somehow use probability as a predictive tool for events, that will give us the same rigor. But there's only a limited number of circumstances in which you can actually apply a probability analysis to intelligence that would give you the same rigor or any level of rigor at all. I mean, most of the events in intelligence that you're trying to predict are by their nature unrepeatable or black swans. And the only way in which you could do probability with any rigor is if it's the kind of event which happens frequently and you have a background set of data on the frequency of its occurrence to then project what the next might look like.
Yeah, but in the context of intelligence, it's not often that somebody's asked to try and predict when a predictable event is going to occur.
Yes. Well, unless it's the kind of, well, I guess you could have within military intelligence analysis where you're up against an enemy that conducts attacks in particular locations very regularly, then you would argue to say, well, based on the frequency propensity that this group has used before over the last 10 years, say Al-Qaeda in Yemen have been going long enough, and you could probably use some sort of limited probability to say, well, chances are the next counterinsurgency activity of this group will be in this area and it will use these methods, and it will happen at a frequency of X per month. So, but it really is those kind of situations where you have an act which you can arguably define as being repeated or repeatable, but being asked to predict the unlikelihood of Al-Qaeda conducting the Twin Towers attack is an entirely different ballgame.
Yes, yeah, and likewise I think a lot of other situations intelligence analysts would be asked to look into or to monitor. No, you're exactly right. I think it is a different ball game entirely, and there's no, so I guess there's no easy sort of shortcut to trying to avoid biases and trying to avoid some of the sort of subconscious effects that you've talked about. Has there been anything though that you've come across, whether it's in your sort of research or reading around it, or in fact from your own experience, where you found that any techniques that analysts and those, particularly if I'm thinking in our audience, who are having to do this type of work where they are looking for ways to try and make sure that they're not, they're not employing their own confirmation bias, etc. Is there anything that you've come across where people can apply it maybe to their work?
I think the only way, from the perspective of my research, the only way you can really have a chance of knowing the risks of bias or knowing what conditions exacerbate the risk and which ones reduce the risk, and then using that to try and make sure that as an analyst you are working under the optimum environment possible, and where you are working under conditions that have been associated with an increased risk in particular biases, that can be used to do targeted challenge function and peer review. Or if you manage a team of analysts and you know that they've been doing a particularly important piece of work under adverse circumstances that are associated with a risk in bias, and you know which bias it is, you can use that information to try and say, well, actually, if it's, say, if they've been conducting a piece of assessment that's based on reams and reams of information, like the trying to analyse whether Iraq were producing biological weapons with the curveball source. That was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports over a long period of time led to that assessment. So if you knew the risks of serial position effects and that primacy is a high risk bias and that it is exacerbated by the more information you have to process, then you might have been able to use that information to say, right, we need to look at the first information these analysts received about this judgment and use that as a way of challenging their current beliefs on it. What kind of information might have had a disproportionate impact or resulted in bias?
Right. Yeah. So that review of it is key, really.
Yes, it's knowing which biases are most likely to have been in effect, and then you can better tailor a challenge function, especially if there's hundreds. If there's so much intelligence information to do an external peer review for, at least it can help you identify what pieces of intelligence might have led to a bias, and then pick those ones to challenge. It basically will give you a greater efficacy in challenge function, just like eliminative induction makes trying to narrow down a field of possibilities more effective. Knowing the risks will hopefully help challenge function more effective. And so the meta-analysis I did help to identify some of the conditions that exacerbate serial position effects and the ones that exacerbate confirmation bias. So at least that might help
Got it. Yeah.
people identify, the chances that they were subject to either, which is quite high.
Right.
Knowing that is helpful enough, because I think people, I certainly, as an analyst, wasn't aware that the risk of bias was that high. If I'd known that there was an 80 to 90% chance that I would be affected by primacy in my judgments, in my professional judgments on a consistent basis, then I might have sought challenge for my judgments more frequently.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's remarkable when you put it to that number. I mean, I'm just sort of, I'm laughing because I think it's astonishing, really, that it is such a high percentage, and that people probably aren't aware of this and they aren't doing anything at all to try and mitigate the effect. So, as you said, if there's something that can be done, I think, to make intelligence analysts more aware of these issues, then maybe they can use challenge analysis more effectively. So I guess that's good advice. That's useful, I think, for people to take away from this. And for anyone who's listening to this podcast, who hopefully has enjoyed this discussion as much as I have, because it's been really fascinating. Where can they go next to read more about this or find out more about this? I know you've got a book coming out soon, which distills a lot of your research. When is that coming out, and can you give us some more details about it?
Yes, it's basically encompasses all of the theoretical critiquing I did of ACH, as well as the empirical study and the meta-analysis. So it's all of the research that we've been discussing during this podcast is in this book. The working title is Belief, Bias and Intelligence, Challenging the ACH Method. It's coming out in September this year as part of Edinburgh University's press series called Intelligence, Surveillance and Secret Warfare. And in addition to that, there are 2 articles that have already been published detailing the results of the study that I did with the PHIA and also of the meta-analysis I did into the particular conditions that increase the risk of serial position effects and confirmation bias. So that information is actually already out there, but the book will wrap it up with the philosophical arguments about why ACH may not be as rigorously applied as we hope it would. So I can send you the details if you want to add that in.
Fantastic. Yeah, happy to share that with anyone in our audience who's interested, for sure. And I'll be keen to have a look at that once it's out. Okay, great stuff. Thanks so much, Martha, for taking the time to join us today. This has been, as I said, really fascinating discussion. I've got a particular interest in this area of the whole process of, how intelligence is done, and I think it's something that is probably it's not focused on enough in open source intelligence specifically. I think it's something that we want to really bring into the discussions around open source intelligence and how it's done, to make sure that people are aware of the, how some of these issues can affect their analysis, really. So thanks so much for coming and joining us, and hopefully we can follow up and talk more in the future about how your research develops and any other conclusions you reach, and perhaps at some point we'll come across a technique that cracks it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the research project I'm currently doing is hoping to extend the meta-analysis to about 50 more biases that affect belief formation. So it should, providing that there's enough underlying research for me to process, it should give a more comprehensive list of factors or understanding of where you could identify risks.
That's superb. Okay, great. We'll look forward to hearing more about that in the future.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Martha.
That's all we've got time for today. Thanks for listening. Please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or on your preferred podcast listening platform. And for more information on how we can help with OSINT training and development, go to janes.com/OSINT training.